Bore da, good morning. Welcome to the first session of the day today, a session gynta o'r gynhadledd rhithiol. So this is a virtual conference that we're doing live on Facebook, and I hope it'll be available then for people to digest at their leisure. So that's the idea. So this is the fifth St. David's Day conference I've held. This one's very, very different because we normally at these headquarters and we get an audience using the facilities at headquarters, but because of the circumstances, we are using new technologies, and this is the team from Dewis-Powys, and I'm really grateful that you've agreed to be taking part in this conference today. And also, thank you for supporting me as the Commissioner here in Dyfed-Powys over recent years, because this isn't the first time you've been involved in our conferences. I think this is probably the third or fourth time that you've been involved. So welcome, Sarah, Rebecca, and Elise.
Thank you.
Very grateful that you've joined me this morning. And the whole idea really is to give you a platform to talk about Dewis-Powys. So I guess the obvious first question is, what is Dewis-Powys? Shall I ask you, Sarah? How would you describe Dewis-Powys?
Okay, well, Dewis-Powys is an initiative that was originally funded by Big Innovation Funded, which is the National Communities Fund, 6 years ago now. And it was in response to our Pan-Wales research that actually noticed there was a significant gap in supporting people over 60 who are experiencing domestic abuse. And often people who did support people over 60 weren't recognising domestic abuse as the issue. They were seeing it as theft from a family member, for example, a grandson, and it was being recorded as that. So originally what we felt was lacking was older people getting involved in designing a service. And so for the first 5 months of the funding, we worked in Carmarthenshire and we worked in Cardiff with groups of older people to design a service. And now 6 years on, we actually have a really highly skilled team of choice support workers led by Elise Freeman. And then the research side, which for us is of global significance and really interesting, is we've been allowed to follow people's help seeking and decision making as they enter the justice system, as they get support from different services, and actually capture the narratives and what they feel as they're approaching different professionals and the outcome of that. So we have a really rich source now of data that we're able to share back through training to professionals. And currently, we've trained about 8,000 professionals across the UK, learning directly from the older people's voices, directly from these victim survivors' experiences. And we've found things that are quite different that we didn't expect. So what happens when dementia, and there's been a diagnosis of dementia around domestic abuse? You know, what are the support systems in place? What happens with a pension if you're an older woman? And, you know, the pension could affect you. And also what happens if you simply cannot get access to support, you don't think that that particular service is for you because the images on it are of younger people with families, and you're not sure that you're eligible for that particular service. So that's essentially what we've been doing for the past 6 years. I'm really happy to say that we are still getting funding and we are attracting, I think, quite a lot of interest. And one of our key findings was around ageism and discrimination on account of age. And I think COVID, one of the very, very few advantages of COVID was that actually this has really shone a light on domestic abuse and particularly the human rights of older people. And that often they're forgotten about, they're ignored, or they can even be overlooked in terms of service provision. So we're learning all the time, but what we really aim to do is share back that with as many people as possible for as long as possible.
Thank you, Sarah. And hopefully during this session this morning, we'll get an opportunity to hear a little bit about the research and also the services that are available. And I think it's important in such a conference like this that we say to people that, you know, if you are suffering, that you need to call out for support. There's the Live Fear-Free helpline. There are national helplines. Seek out that support, and there'll be somebody there to support you. It doesn't always have to be the police service, but obviously, from my point of view, obviously the police service are there to support in these situations. So thank you. So it's 6 years that you've been working, and that's a long period of time. So there's probably lots and lots of data that you've got now that is informing your research. So what you mentioned some of the issues in relation to ageism. You mentioned sort of the control around finances. So what are the big headlines? And I wonder whether Rebecca, you wanted to come in and talk a little bit about the research itself, and maybe some of the methodologies you used, and how that is now informing practitioner activity, which is the key thing about research, isn't it? That we get the impact on people that are working in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. We've used a range of research methodologies, really, because we've been capturing data from a range of sources. So primarily our data is collected through the clients that have been involved with Dewis Choice and been supported by the project. And we've really followed their journey from right at the beginning of their involvement to post and into that recovery period. So it can be up to 3 years. So it's a very longitudinal prospective study that we're capturing along the way, and speaking to those older people, be they men, women, regardless of their age, sexuality. So we're capturing their lived experiences. We're gleaning from them what they have found has been helpful, what maybe hasn't been as helpful, and how they've engaged with those justice processes. And we very much see justice in a loose sense, in a subjective sense, in how that older person views justice and what it means to them. So it's not just around a criminal approach that people often assume. It could be justice in terms of their community or what they're receiving themselves in terms of help and support. So we've really been using that learning. It's been fed back into us as a service through Dewis Choice, and then also been pushed out in terms of that delivery of training that we've done. But we've also been working very closely with communities across Wales, England, Scotland and Northern Ireland to really gather the thoughts of older people generally around the subject area of domestic abuse in later life, but also around what they value in terms of their social networks, in terms of positive aging, to challenge some of those ageist stereotypes. So it's been a real reciprocal learning process, I would say, from us gleaning from them what they value and feel is important, but also from them hearing about healthy relationships in later life and what help and support is available. So we've done lots of community engagement. Co-production has been a key thing that has run through the project. Sarah mentioned the very design of Dewis Choice being designed by communities, but we've also co-produced a film exploring older LGBT victim survivors' lived experiences of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse in later life is a very hidden issue, but when you add the additional sexuality on top of that, it's even further, invisible. So it's really important that we capture that diverse range of the 3 generations of older people, and really bring light to their experiences in later life of this issue.
Thank you, Rebecca. And it is, you mentioned, there is a longitudinal study as well, and I perhaps, because I was just thinking, I haven't mentioned that today's focus is on victims. So today's conference is a focus on victims. I should have said that right at the beginning. But what I got out of what you were describing there is that there's an opportunity for the victim's voice to really shape some of the services. Is that, I'm glad you're nodding, so I'm obviously saying the right things. But that,
absolutely, yeah. It's very important to us that everything that we do involves older people, and to the extent that they want to be involved and how they want to be involved is most important, and give that voice. Often, the research is done on behalf of older people, and we've very much seen from our earlier work that Sarah Weidel led with the Older People's Commissioner, which was Pam Wales, that practitioners' perceptions of what older people want and their help-seeking experiences is very different to what the older people are actually directly telling us through this work we're doing now.
Brilliant. So the services then that you've as a team been delivering, what does that look like? What is that? How would you describe that to people that might be listening today? Then, who wants to come in? Elise, do you want to come in and talk about some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think Rebecca and Sarah both really touched on that diversity of older age, and that is what we found really, that there are some very complex situations. There's many intersections in later life. So some of the people we're meeting with, their experiences may reflect that of a younger person with domestic abuse, but they may also look very different. So we're seeing caring dynamics, sometimes health and mobility issues coming into play there too, but also the complexity of those relationships. So as alongside intimate partner abuse, we're also seeing abuse from those adult family members, which is obviously a lot more prevalent when we're working with older clients. So we found actually it's been a very proactive response that's been needed, and we really do advocate those community-based outreach style services that are really crucial to older people. I think there's something that we do fairly well in Wales from what I'm hearing comparably to some of the services in England, but something that definitely needs to be more visible in our commissioning of services ongoing. We found working with the referrals that we've had come in that it takes a lot of very proactive work to build trust with that person to enable them to engage. So it's a much longer process than you have with a younger person. And I think that's one of the key things that we're building into our training, really, to upskill generic domestic abuse services to be able to respond in that way. It's also really crucial, we found, to have that multi-agency work in place. So we never work in isolation, and some of our most effective outcomes for people have been when we've joined forces with the adult safeguarding teams, when we've worked with the police, when we've worked with maybe health as well, and with housing. And we've formed a sort of almost a response around that person that's been very proactive. Another key area of work that we're involved in really is work with family members, and where we identify that it's safe and positive to do that, then we will work with family members that are supporting that older person, which I think again is probably quite unique about what we do as a service. And we tend to work to upskill those family members to understand the experience of the older person, to remove some of those victim blaming attitudes, but also that they understand issues around coercive control as well, so they're better able to support that older person moving forward. So it's Sarah, I think Sarah wanted to come in there.
Sorry. I think what really springs to mind, because we're in a position, we're so fortunate to be resourced in such a way and have the luxury that we can provide intensive support for that older person. So it's not just at the crisis point, it's right through the process and out in terms of the recovery period. And because I suppose our absolutely key ethos was around informed choice and ensuring that person was in a position to make informed choices. They had the knowledge, it was accessible knowledge, it was written down, we were accessible. What we've been able to really do, I suppose the overarching finding of the research is actually dispel some of the myths about why people leave or why people stay. And I think for us, that's been really interesting. Because there are certain assumptions, within certain sectors that assume that older people don't want to leave. And even if they're experiencing abuse and neglect, they will stay in their situation. The reality is, if the support's in place, and if there is, as Elise said, that very proactive multi-agency response because of the complexity, so their housing, their health, the family members who are safe to talk to, are supported, they do actually choose to leave that partner. And, it's been interesting for us following that, because what we've encountered from their stories is, for example, an 85-year-old wanted a divorce. She'd had 40 years of abuse, of, sexual abuse, physical, emotional, and severe financial abuse. Her family members had also been abused, as they grew up. So you had that intergenerational effect. The actual perpetrator was quite a sort of credible character, well respected in the community. And it was really important for her, once she made the decision to leave, that she had this divorce. She went to a solicitor, and the solicitor said, "Why do you want to do that at your age?" And this, was quite symbolic for her. To her, this was justice. This was her interpretation of her identity shifting. And I think it's those sort of external barriers that we've been able to capture that have really dispelled and helped and are helping to, I hope, challenge some of these very set assumptions that people have. And not all practitioners, certainly not, but certainly we've come across different responses. And there's also a stereotype view about later life and what you expect in later life. So it's been great to actually physically see, as a researcher, a person change over the time that you've worked with them. So you actually see their appearance change, their posture, their health improve when they're feeling empowered and supported. And you actually feel as though they're now planning a new life. So it's very, I think, rewarding to be able to follow that journey and actually see some of the wonderful work, we do in Wales, and different practitioners support us in doing. So it's really been a very interesting study from that point. And we're very fortunate as researchers to have that, relationship with the people we're working with, that they trust us enough to share this information.
Yeah.
Sorry, Elise. I just wanted to add that.
Excellent. And I'm not sure whether I should have received what you said as a subtle hint to a police and crime commissioner about the services that we should commission, and to ultimately to have specific services in place for people over 60. I think you said the study covered. And I'm aware also that on the chat there's a chat facility if somebody wanted to sort of make comments and ask questions, that there is somebody interested in the research. So to go on to the Dewis Choice, I think it's dewisschoice.org.uk is the website. And you can go on to that website, and we'll put some of these details, we'll post them on the chat so that people can see what the research says, because just the comments that you made there, Sarah, in relation to how these biases come into play, where we maybe start to frame justice during a particular period within the life cycle, and to say, well, actually over a certain age, and that's, what that question that you posed from the practitioner, sort of saying, well, why, from the professional, why are you doing it now at your age? Well, why not? That shouldn't be a question that somebody poses. It wouldn't be a question posed to somebody at the age of, in their 20s or 30s. So why pose the question to somebody when they're in their 80s? So I think it's really refreshing that the research, and as you said, that, something that we're championing here in Wales is having an impact, is having an impact, not just across the sort of nations of the United Kingdom, but also further afield. So have you managed to get out and into international conferences and travel the world? How has it been?
We have had significant interest, and I think for us that has been really helpful. We've had people from America and Canada come to visit the project, to see it as a piece of good research practice. We've also had people, academics from Stirling University, Northern Ireland, come to actually work together on some of the ideas that have come out from the older people. And they've actually also met with some of our older people and talked directly to them. So there's been probably, I think, various aspects that are all on the website about our activities and what we've done in different settings. We're also potentially, as Rebecca said, we've produced 2 short films that are going into film awards, and we're currently in the process of speaking with documentary makers about the work of Dewis Choice and our findings there. I think as well, what we are really quite surprised at, and when we look at more and more data and share data with other academics, is just the patterning of abuse and some of the differences in later life. So for example, and this is quite a political issue in a sense, is that many services are, solely for women and girls, and, domestic abuse is gendered, and often male victim survivors, it's very hard for them to find services. What we know in terms of later life is that although women still are predominantly the victims and men are the perpetrators, we see a significant increase in men actually experiencing abuse, not just from intimate partners, and they may be male or female, but also from family members. And the nature of that abuse can be quite different. And this is also borne out in other patterns. So for us, it's been really interesting to look at, for example, American large data sets and actually see that, potentially just over a quarter of older victims are male. And also with our client group, a third of our clients are male victim survivors. What's also been interesting is the different response that they get because of, being male or being female or being disabled or maybe having dementia, and how that affects their access to services and the choices that they have. So I think for us, being able to share that back in terms of journals, books and literature more widely has really generated a lot of interest, and a lot of interest in Wales, and some of the innovative things we've done, like having an older people's commissioner to champion older people. I think that's really generated a lot of interest in some of the policies and practices we have in Wales. And Elise, who has a particular interest in the legislation, has been able to really give input directly, because we, in a sense, we wear many hats. You can have one person with many hats. So Elise sits on the Older People's Commissioner Strategy Group. She's been able to feed directly about COVID and the housing issue for older people who were shielding, etc., couldn't necessarily access a refuge, directly so speaking truth to power much more efficiently and directly than perhaps that would have happened in other settings.
Yeah, and so it leads in relation to the sort of legislative framework that's in place currently, then, that is something that potentially needs changing, tweaking. I don't know what the right word to use would be, but you would certainly. So what would you advocate? Things. And again, I know the three of you well enough now, I think, to be able to say, speak truth to power. If there's something you want your local police and crime commissioner or the whole police commissioners, in Wales to get together and do and support you with, now's your chance, I guess, to tell me about it. But so what would you say to that sort of question?
Again, I think some of the legislation designed to respond to domestic abuse is really focused on those intimate partner relationships and on responding to younger people, but it can leave older people falling between the gaps, because the dynamic that's happening with that abuse doesn't quite fit in with the legislation. I think particularly when we're looking at our coercive control legislation, that excludes those who are actually experiencing coercive control from somebody that they're not living with. We've seen that sort of evidence with quite a few of the clients that we've worked with, where they're experiencing very high levels of coercive control from a family member that's coming in and is perhaps playing part of delivering care and things like that for them, but actually falls outside of that coercive control legislation because they're not actually living in the same home as the older person. I think also in terms of sort of around, if we're looking at areas like willful neglect, which again, can be disguised by that care dynamic. If there's an assessment of a loss of capacity, then they'll fall under the Mental Capacity Act with that. But for those that don't fall under the Act, that willful neglect crime doesn't cover those family members as well, just professional care. So we're sort of seeing those pockets where perhaps the legislature hasn't really thought about this when domestic abuse doesn't look like our typical domestic abuse between an intimate partner. So.
But there's also pathways and procedures, I think, that make it actually increase the dangerousness, the risk of harm. For example, the risk assessment, the standard form, which is a DASH, domestic abuse, stalking, harassment form, is designed in such a way that it's scored. And although there's an element of discretion there, some of the questions are about children, pregnancy. And again, for an older person, a lot of the issues around aging are masked. And so people make assumptions, they've got a small social network, they're isolated. Well, that's just part of being older. You retire, you retreat. So those assumptions about aging mask people actually looking and asking the questions more deeply. And the risk assessment isn't fitting in terms of the school. So we've looked at our case studies, and we've got experience of this now back to sort of 2012, the Access to Justice study we did, looking at 131 cases. And essentially, when we looked at them and scored them, the risk assessment was considerably higher, because we felt there had been, masks because of aging, but also people couldn't ask the right questions because they weren't sure how to ask. But also it's that relationship building to actually be in a position, risk is dynamic, it changes over time. It's getting that situational and temporal sort of factors in place so you can have that conversation. And I think for us, knowing what's happening in terms of domestic homicide rates in the over 60 age group, this is something that really needs to address, just not at a local level, but also at a national level. It's a real failing within the system, that the very form you use that gives you access to specialist domestic abuse services, if you go above a certain threshold, people over 60 just rarely get above that threshold. And that really concerns us.
I think it also is that dynamic risk assessment that is ongoing. We've learned from speaking to the older people that help seeking is very incremental. They'll disclose little bits of information, start testing the waters, seeing how people respond to that, and being able to still retain control over that situation. And as that relationship of trust builds up and they feel that they're more in control and have that power to exercise that control, they'll just start to disclose more information. So it's been 6-7 months down the line before maybe the sexual abuse has been described or even disclosed. So help seeking is very ongoing and continuous process. People often think of it as a one point of disclosure and that's it. But actually it's not. And in terms of looking at homicides and the work that Jane Monckton-Smith has done, it's not necessarily about the severity of the violence that predicts the homicide, but it's about the frequency and the escalation of that. And that really, I think, emphasizes that importance of that ongoing risk assessment.
And I think if you look at the domestic homicides that actually focus on older people, and also where we see near misses, and where we've actually talked with some of our victim survivors, one of the key issues there is they're not heard or listened to. So in a sense, they're a best judge of their sort of dangerousness and their current situation. And if people aren't listening to what they say, they're listening to their carer, they're listening to somebody else who might be younger and appear or come across as more credible. It happened with the case of Mr. C in Brighton. It was his younger carer, essentially, who murdered him. He disclosed to several different practitioners in health, in different settings. And because of how he presented as an older man, he wasn't listened to. Everything he said, he was just seen just partly it's compassionate ageism, but actually partly it's just simple discrimination. in terms of who people hear and the validity of those people and the credibility of them.
Well, you know, this talk could go on for hours, couldn't it? Because what I wanted to share with you as well is that I've been the senior responsible officer working within a steering group with Welsh Government on domestic homicide reviews. But I've been taking responsibility of trying to develop a repository of the reviews themselves to ensure that we can improve the use of the learning from those reviews and get that out to practitioners. So we've had some great news over the last week, actually, that we've got some money from Welsh Government to put it on firmer foundations, and there also will be a research analyst assigned to that project over the next 12 months. And the first thing I'm going to ask that person to do is to come and speak to Dewis Choice. And hopefully by that point, they can jump in the car and get to Aberystwyth University, which is where you're based. And where you work out of. And I'm sure the university are quite proud of the research that you've undertaken as well. I'm assuming, is that if you've had recognition by the university, now's your chance.
We have, and I think what's been really wonderful about Aberystwyth as a university is its willingness to be quite daring. This was quite a daring project. We've never run a service of this nature, and few higher education institutes would, alongside a longitudinal study. So there was that willingness to be flexible and actually do things differently. It's been interesting for us sort of to actually negotiate some of those differences. But the support, I think, for us, it has definitely been there right from the outset. And I think there is, or I'd like to think there is a degree of pride in what, the team have achieved and the work that they've done. And also the feedback we've had from, the best thing of all. I mean, somebody asked me the other day what I was most proud of, and it is seeing that transformation in terms of the clients, and the work that Elise and her team do. For me, that's just wonderfully satisfying to see that change, but also then to go out and train and actually get the response that we've had in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in other areas, that this is a significant gap, and they are really hungry for knowledge actually on some of these new areas that we've discovered as we've gone along with the project. So, fingers crossed we're able to ensure that we can really share that back, because again, it's been nice giving our free guidance, which we've now delivered, I think, 2,000 copies to different police forces and different services, even sort of fire services across the UK. And that, again, giving that to our clients and then being able to see that their stories actually informed that guidance, again, makes them feel that there's something happening. And I think when you can do that in research, it does feel quite satisfying, because as you know, David, often you might produce a report, but nobody reads it. It sort of gathers dust on a shelf. So
what are you saying about any research I've been involved in, Sarah? Are you saying that it's just gathered dust? Come on.
Some of mine certainly has gathered dust. But I think to actually see that transition, and for people to see that what they've said and shared, which can be painful, it's a courageous thing to share that story over time. When they've actually seen the result of that, or they've been in the film and actually contributed to a film to help raise awareness, I think that really makes a difference in terms of their recovery as well.
And I guess with everything that's been discussed and talked about this morning, is there's just that shifting of and widening, for want of a better description, of understanding and knowledge, which I think can only be a good thing ultimately for practitioners, but also the raising of awareness in that cohort of the population. Is that something that you've been trying to achieve as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We speak to a variety of different audiences, be they academics, practitioners, at frontline level or managerial or strategic level, but also the community as well. And we've got a pool of 380 volunteers, and that's a real intergenerational approach. Our youngest is 8, and I think our eldest is 93 now. So yeah, we do try to reach as many different audiences as we can, because, you know, to tackle this problem really needs that kind of whole everybody's business approach to respond to this.
Yeah, I was going to ask a specific question. It went out of my head and it's slipped back in now. So it was about justice. It was about the comment that I think that was made about, taking a less sort of linear view of or one-dimensional view of what justice means. But linked to that, then I'm just intrigued in terms of the police activity in some of this. So from a victim perspective, you know, it might look a bit different from the victim's perspective than the police service in relation to that justice. And what I mean by that, you know, is there any truth in maybe the belief that the victim just wants the activity to stop? You know, that may be sufficient, you know, or they would want either the actions to stop by the perpetrator, or that they would want to move out of the situation that they're in, and that to them could be seen as justice. Whereas from a policing point of view, you know, it's to do something with the perpetrator and take them through the courts. Does that very clumsily sort of try to ask a question about it? But how does your research sort of talk about that aspect?
Elise, do you want to give a view on this?
Yeah, I think sort of from working with the clients from their perspective, it's very individual, isn't it? How people view justice. And I think what is key to it initially is that people really understand what their options are and have those really clearly explained to them and know what they look like. And it's an explanation of the process. So it's not just about really, would you like to make a report? Do you want to take this forward? But it's, what is that going to look like if you do? And I think that fear factor is quite a barrier we've found for a lot of our older people who've actually said later down the line, I would have took this further, but I didn't really understand what that would look like, and also what support I would have in place to do that. But I think in terms of these justice options, if we're looking at sort of from a criminal and civil point of view, it's going back and offering that again is so important, because what we've found is as people start to get support, start to build confidence, their views of actually what they want to do and what actions they want to take change dramatically. So it is really going back and offering that again. And also, if there's a call out to a property at a later date, if somebody said no the first time, they might say yes the next time. So it's offering that again and saying, look, I know you weren't ready to do this last time, but let's have a look at it again and see if, you know, we can put some support in place for you to do this. Yeah, sorry, go on, Sarah.
No, Elise, go on.
I was going to say, but in the same way, I'm sorry, there's a cup of coffee just arriving behind. I'm not going to send it away.
It's really good coffee, by the way.
Yeah, very good.
I love
very valid point there as well, that for some people, actually, just some measures that are going to stop or minimise what is going to happen to them might be actually what they want. So they may not want to go through a criminal or a civil process, but they might want help to remove somebody from their home, to make their home feel a more secure and safe place, or they may choose to move themselves. And I think quite often that's not offered as an option to older people, or they don't know that actually that could be an option, that they can get help with housing support to move. And some of our older people who are maybe living in a family home with younger family members and they're experiencing abuse don't realise actually that they can get help from housing to move out of that situation and live independently, and maybe get some other support from other agencies to replace, you know, what they were relying on from family members. So it is a range of options, but really going back and reviewing those options and offering them again.
And I think as well, what we've noticed with some of our clients is that just how important it is for someone, that they see it in a certain position, who they respect and value, actually saying, what happened to you was wrong. You know, this was wrong and you were not responsible for it. You've no need to feel guilty about it. There was nothing in your behaviour that caused this. that's it. That can be enough in terms of justice, to hear that from somebody in their community who they respect and look up to. And I think then for them to be aware that there's that sort of public acknowledgement that they were not in the wrong. I think another point I want to make as well in following some of our clients through the justice system is there's often, a fair level of support going up to that court process. But what we've found has been hardest for people is the aftermath. So you're managing expectations, which I think is hugely important in terms of the reality of the court process. But actually the aftermath, people just seem to fall off a cliff in terms of the support falls away. And that's when the mental health can become more fragile, become more of an issue for that older person, because suddenly resources aren't there for them, and they've then had this build up and this process, and then suddenly everyone has gone who was listening to them and giving them advice. And I think that for us is an area that really needs looking at in terms of that person's recovery. We're all very sort of front-ended crisis intervention, getting that process through different systems. It's that aftermath that I think is really important for that person's journey beyond, so they can have a quality of life in later life that we all hope we'll get. In terms of not just end of life, but also, the decades before that. And once they've chosen a different route in terms of stopping the abuse and for them.
I think.
Sorry, go on, Rebecca.
I think it's the idea of procedural justice as well is just as important as the outcome. So as long as that individual feels that they've been treated fairly, with respect, they've been listened to and believed, and their experiences have been validated, for them that process can be more important than the actual outcome.
And it's what I'm hearing loud and clear is that acknowledgement. It's just the acknowledgement of their experiences and what they've been through at that very early point in the process. And the other thing I'm hearing as well is that, and I think Rebecca, you said it first of all, is that sort of that there's an incremental disclosure, that it isn't an immediate disclosure and everything will come out. And in order for that to be nurtured, for want of better description, it requires the services to be there for a longer period of time, as opposed to what can happen in quite a sterile way, certainly from a policing point of view, from sort of my experience, is that it's sort of a little bit of a start and finish. We talked about the DASH assessments, they're scored, there's a low, medium, high risk assessment, and again, echoing the comments, Sarah, you made in relation to the post criminal justice period as well, that let's not put a time frame on some of these services, that the services are there throughout and can be available throughout, which is probably quite challenging. And there's a financial implication to some of this, but very important. Sarah, did you want to come back in?
Just briefly, I think one of the things we've really learnt from this, and credit to Elise for having the approach that she's always had, is ensuring that relationship with other services. And I think because of that, that's actually prevented duplication. It's really helped eyes and ears on the ground in safeguarding that person and keeping them safe. But also in terms of the longer recovery period, there's been that communication across services so that services aren't overstretched. I mean, as you know, David, they are stretched anyway, but there is that multi-agency response that can alleviate some of those resource issues, because I think again, Elise and the team are highly trained. They're independent sexual violence advocates and IDVAs, and they've also got training around dementia and lots of other areas. But I think because of that training, they've opened avenues into other services and partnership work that perhaps we wouldn't have approached originally, or we wouldn't have assumed that we would ever work with them. So I think, again, it's been that broad base of partnership working that's made a really significant difference. And thanks to Elise, having that attitude, I think that's been helpful in developing and training our staff base.
Oh, brilliant. We're sort of coming to the end, sadly, because we've only got a certain allotted amount of time, really, for these sessions today. Like I said earlier, we could be talking for hours. And there are so many different aspects to the work that you do in the first instance, but also the research and the learning that's come out of the work that you've done that is so fascinating. So I'm really, really grateful for the three of you joining me on this session. Hopefully we've had some interest online, but also people will digest this post the event then, because it will still be available for people to look at, and we'll be trying to promote it and get maybe some of the students interested in it as well at the university, to understand the fantastic work that you've been doing there out of Aberystwyth University. So Sarah, Rebecca, Elise, thank you for your time this morning, and
thank you.
I look forward to continue. So the partnership that we've had where you've joined my conferences has been fantastic. I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.
Bye.